And we're going to do Hashivenu right now. And so, Avi, if you want to be part of this, you can too. Some of you know this. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Vena, Shuva, Vena, Shuva, Chadesh, Chadesh, Yameinu kekedem. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Vena, Shuva, Vena, Welcome to everybody who's joined us recently. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. I see friends in the back. I think Beth and Sally came, and the shared house, so great, and Barbara, all the way from LA. So first of all, really an honor that you're spending Yontif with us. I am fascinated by the last verse in the book of Eicha, also known as Lamentations, that we read on Tisha B'Av. Many of us recognize it as the final words we say every time we return the Torah to the Ark. Hashivenu Adonai, Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh Yameinu, Chadesh Yameinu kekedem. Help us return to you, and we will return. Renew our lives as in days of old. It's that last word in particular, kekedem, as in days of old, that captivates my imagination. Exactly which days of old are we longing to return to when we sing this on Tisha B'Av or after we read the Torah? In a post-Tisha B'Av sermon I offered many years ago, I attempted to examine this question through the lens of Jewish history. I concluded that kekedem was a moving target that could change depending on where and when one lived on the Jewish historical timeline. There have always been ebbs and flows between periods of great upheaval for the Jewish people, interspersed with a few decades or even centuries of relative calm here and there. In the scheme of recorded Jewish history, which some say really dates back to the reign of King David about 3,000 years ago, This pattern has been repeated hundreds of thousands of times. Jews have been dispersed throughout the Middle East, Asia, and more recently Europe for millennia. Bloody times in one region were often periods of Jewish flourishing in another. We are tasked to remember as much as we can from our past, to honor the ancestors on whose shoulders we stand, and not to repeat mistakes. We record our history and conversations so that generations of Jews who will never meet one another can communicate. One of the names for Rosh Hashanah is Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance, because we want God to remember us as individuals and a collective people who are responsible for one another and share a glorious history. Our memories, like our sacred texts, may get distorted or reframed to help us cope with whatever the trouble du jour may be, but Jews overall have done a pretty good job of facing history and ourselves for as long as people have been chanting the words Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Whatever our days of old may be at any given time, an essential subtext to that might be reframed this way. Even though life was not ideal back then, if only we had known then what we know now, perhaps we could have reduced the amount of pain and suffering in our day. In addition to being a day of remembrance, Rosh Hashanah has three other designations: Yom Harat Olam, the birthday of the world; Yom Teruah, the day of sounding the alarm; and Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. The theological drama being played out here is that the first of Tishrei is day one of our 10-day-long trial in God's courtroom. During the month of Elul, we've been preparing our case and gathering evidence, and closing remarks will be delivered on Yom Kippur. This is the third year in a row that I am compelled to address the climate crisis in my Rosh Hashanah sermon. My desperation is growing, and yours should be too. During the month of Elul that concluded yesterday, the natural world cried out through ferocious, unprecedented fire, water, and wind episodes that have taken lives, destroyed homes and livelihoods, and shattered communities world over. The monetary consequences are too large for most of us to fathom. There will be more disasters this year, and even more in 2022. I invite each of us to consider personally for a moment how we will be judged in God's courtroom for just last year's record on respecting human life, wildlife, and the natural world. What have we done to rectify or exacerbate the environmental devastation before us? The central poem of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf service, Unatana Tokef, highlights both our individual and collective accountability for the welfare of the entire world. With every passing year, these words gain resonance as if they were written for our time. The great shofar will be sounded, and the still small voice will be heard. Angels will be alarmed, seized with fear and trembling, declaring, "The very day of judgment, this day, for even the hosts of heaven are judged. No one is innocent in your sight. All that lives on earth will pass before you like a flock of sheep. As a shepherd examines his flock, making each sheep pass under the staff, so you will review, God, and number and count, judging each living being, determining the fate of everything in creation, and inscribing their destiny. On Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on the fast of the Day of Atonement it is sealed, how many will pass on and how many will be born, who will live and who will die, who will live a long life and who will come to an untimely end, who will perish by fire and who by water, who by gun and who by beast, who by hunger and who by thirst, who by earthquake and who by plague, who will be strangled and who will be stoned, who will be at peace and who will be troubled, who will be serene and who will be disturbed, who will be tranquil and who will be tormented, who will be impoverished, who will be enriched, who will be brought low, and who will be raised up. How can any of us truly be at peace, serene, or tranquil amidst the broad undercurrents of insanity threatening the lives we took for granted not even 2 decades ago? We are living through a pandemic which has been the cause of death for more than 4.5 million people worldwide, 650,000 in the United States alone. Uncontrollable wildfires are ravaging California, Siberia, and the Mediterranean, and other places for the 5th year in a row. 15 to 21 named storms, an estimated 10 of which will become full-blown hurricanes, are expected to form in the Atlantic Ocean this season alone. The lack of political will to institute desperately needed gun regulation of any kind has made possible a relentless barrage of civilian shootings that are so common we don't even raise an eyebrow when we hear about them anymore, which is just what the gun lobby wanted. Food and housing insecurity is an all-time high and escalating, driven by an ever-widening gap between the wealthy and everyone else. I could go on. What happens to animals when their lives are threatened and their habitat is destroyed? They engage in aberrant behavior just to survive, initially foraging for food and shelter in places they do not belong, ill-suited to host them, until they are killed or caught, and ultimately perish because they have nowhere to live, nest, and thrive. As so many of us find ourselves in shock day after day about the state of the world, is it any wonder that people have lost their minds? We can deflect, we can distort, and we can cast dispersion for only so long. Nature is God's creation just as we are, with one key difference. Humans can deceive, nature does not. Though the wealthy will be able to manage environmental disaster with greater ease and less long-term repercussion on a per-episode basis, ultimately, nature will not discriminate. Neither do crazy killers. Although I have always understood that illness and tragedy are a part of life and somewhat random, I am mindful that in the next year, people we all know are likely to fall victim to a modern plague that goes uncontained because of willful misinformation, a natural disaster, or a random shooting. There, but for the grace of God, go all of us. We will say 3 times during the Musaf service, Hayom Harat Olam, Hayom Ya'amid Bamishpat, Kol Yitzurei Olamim. Today the world stands at birth. Today all creation is called to judgment. The world has not had many happy birthdays recently. I am reminded of a silly song that I learned at summer camp in the 60s and 70s, which tells you how old I am, sung to kids who were celebrating birthdays at camp. It went something like this. It's not exact. Happy birthday, happy birthday, There's pollution in the air, people dying everywhere, but happy birthday, happy birthday. Now, it did not occur to me when I was 9 that this tongue-in-cheek dining hall dirge would actually become humorless 50 years later because of the irreversible conditions of human and environmental abuse set in motion and willfully uncontained for decades. So what days of old, Kedem, could we return to realistically that might have something to teach us about how to address the life and death issue of global warming? Thinking back to my camp days, the 1960s embodied the best of times and the worst of times, at once traumatic and full of promise. On the one hand, the civil rights movement culminated in race riots throughout the country that indelibly changed the landscape of our cities. Centuries-old racial tensions were temporarily masked by white flight to the suburbs. Legendary leaders with extraordinary potential were assassinated. We were mired in the Vietnam War with no clear end in sight. At the same time, Johnson's war on poverty was so impactful for the good of this country that many of the programs emerging from this national commitment, like Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and expanded Social Security, are now simply taken for granted. The America we know today would be unrecognizable without the creation of Johnson's Great Society, and there is no way to quantify that positive impact. Likewise, the 1970s, with all of its challenges, was a window of time of great hope and promise with respect to environmental repair. The first Earth Day that took place when Margot Scher was 9 years old on April 22nd, 1970, was a breakthrough event. Before 1970, a factory could spew black clouds of toxic smoke into the air and dump tons of toxic waste into a nearby stream, and that was perfectly legal. Companies couldn't be taken to court to stop it. There was no Environmental Protection Agency, no Clean Air Act, no Clean Water Act. There was no legal or regulatory mechanisms to protect our environment. In the spring of 1970, Senator Gaylord Nelson created Earth Day as a way to force this issue onto the national agenda. 20 million Americans demonstrated in different U.S. cities, and it worked. In December of 1970, Congress authorized the creation of a new federal agency to tackle environmental issues, the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Now, this independent agency of our government tasked with environmental protection matters was proposed by Richard Nixon on July 9, 1970, and went into operation on December 2nd the same year when Nixon signed an executive order. These revolutionary policies literally brought life back to the dead. We cleaned up Lake Erie, so polluted in the 1960s that no fish could live there. Within a decade, the fish had returned. Rivers were no longer spontaneously combusting because there was so much toxic waste callously dumped into them. And California's horrible smog pollution was greatly reduced. That was true progress. Now, Nixon was not known as a passionate environmentalist, but he also created a council to consider how to organize federal government programs designed to reduce pollution efficiently in concert with the broader goals of his administration. A few years later, in 1977, Exxon, then one of the world's largest oil companies and now the largest as ExxonMobil, did an extensive study on global warming, 11 years before the existential catastrophe actually came to light as a public issue. Now, their comprehensive study on the impact of CO2 emissions was the most extensive done to date. Ultimately, though, corporate greed dictated how this sobering information was used and disseminated. They spent decades refusing to publicly acknowledge climate change and actually promoted climate misinformation. Like the tobacco industry before it, the fossil fuel industry knew their products would not stay profitable once the world understood all the risks. But smoking-induced lung cancer does not lie, and neither do the laws of nature. When glaciers melt, sea levels rise, oceans warm, and once vibrant, beautiful coastland cities become uninhabitable. And truth be told, as much as big oil lied to us, consumers did not mind being lied to. I'll put myself in this category. We liked our bigger cars, cheaper fuel, bigger homes farther away from the city. Taxpayers and city leaders chose not to invest in public transportation. It was a group effort, at least for a while. Not unrelated, the world is also dealing with a plastic pollution catastrophe. Since 1950, humans have produced more than 8 billion tons of plastic. Plastics are made from natural gas, oil, or plants, which are refined into ethane and propane and then treated with heat in a process called cracking, which turns them into ethylene or propylene that are combined together to create different polymers to create different kinds of plastics. Plastic itself has been a revolutionary substance that is needed for medical devices, appliances, and so much more. But single-use plastic bags, bottles, and wrappers are deadly. Deadly. More than half of all single-use plastic created goes straight into landfills, where it will decompose over the next 1,000 years. Only about 9% is currently recycled, and most of the plastic that isn't recycled or sent to landfills ends up in our oceans. It is estimated that anywhere from 4.8 to 12.7 million metric tons of plastic enter the oceans every year, injuring and killing marine life that is already being taxed by gross overfishing, rising temperatures that make their habitats uninhabitable. The whole picture is nothing short of heartbreaking and devastating. 25 companies produce 55% of the world's virgin polymer production, with ExxonMobil, thank you, as the largest manufacturer today. When oil and gas companies are finally forced to do a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting for their crimes against humanity, their role in promoting single-use plastics for decades longer than they should have will be high on the list of great sins they must atone for. We as consumers should not buy them. 1988, 33 years ago, was at the time the hottest year on record, and when leaders of the world began to take notice of what we now observe every day. 1 year later, in 1989, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, was established under the United Nations to provide a scientific view of climate change and its political and economic impacts. As global warming gained currency as a real phenomenon, researchers dug into possible ramifications of a warming climate. Among the predictions back in 1989, listen to this, were warnings of severe heat waves, droughts, and more powerful hurricanes fueled by rising sea surface temperatures. Other studies predicted that as massive glaciers at the poles melt, sea levels could rise between 11 and 38 inches by 2100, enough to swamp many of the cities along the east coast of the United States. This past summer, the IPCC came out with their 6th report since 1989, and suffice it to say that their initial prediction was generously optimistic. The latest report lays out what climate was like in the past, what it's like now, and what it's going to be for decades to come. And it shows how humans can affect future climate through the actions they take or don't take now to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases. Under most of the scenarios discussed in this report, warming will continue well beyond 2040 through the remainder of the century. In the worst cases, where the world does little to reduce emissions, temperatures by 2100 could be 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, which is 5.5 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. That would have catastrophic consequences. But the report does show that aggressive, rapid, and widespread emission cuts, beginning now, could limit the warming beyond 2050. In the most optimistic scenario, reaching net zero emissions could even bring warming back to slightly under 1.5 degrees Celsius in the second half of the century. I am deflated when I consider how we could have helped ourselves if world leaders had taken action 20 years ago. The air we breathe today is much cleaner than it would have been had the laws of the 1970s not been enacted. We have not been able to make headway on the critical issue of global warming in the last 33 years because of the worst in human nature. Greed and thirst for power have led to willful spread of misinformation, the concealing of scientific findings, and the lack of political will to hold corporations accountable. It is no coincidence that in the 1980s, changes were made regarding how corporate money could be used to influence politicians, political campaigns, and fuel distorted news outlets. With the added 21st century blessing and curse of the internet and social media that allows anyone from anywhere to read anything at any time, compounded by our capacity for targeted communication that allows us to reach people most susceptible to misinformation, we are climbing a battle that is so uphill, it is hard to not want to give up. This cocktail of new normal modes of behavior are fueling heightened radical tensions, racial tensions, scapegoating, deep hate and distrust of the other, a resurgence of anti-Semitism worldwide, and the erosion of democracies around the world, including right here at home. These serious social ills are all deflecting the urgency with which we must address the climate crisis. Now, anyone who knows me personally knows that I will be leaving this earth with a negligible footprint. For decades, I have reused, repurposed, and recycled. Inspired by my mother and my aunts, I waste nothing, including energy. And so what? Big deal. What can I do? A close colleague had recommended that I read a book called The Choice by Holocaust survivor and psychologist Edith Eva Eger. In her best-selling book, Dr. Eger shares her personal journey of survival, coming to terms with her past and her goal of helping every reader escape the prisons of their minds, no matter what they are living through. Dr. Philip Zimbardo wrote the introduction to Edith's book, and his area of expertise is studying the psychological foundations of negative forms of social influence to better understand the mechanisms by which we conform, obey, and stand by when in fact progress can only be served if we choose a more heroic or courageous path. He credits Dr. Eger with showing him the true meaning of heroism. She posits that heroism is a mindset and a way of being that requires taking effective action at crucial junctures to make an active attempt to address injustice or create positive change in the world, even if you yourself may not be the beneficiary. There is heroic potential in all of us that we must try to cultivate day by day and person by person. Dr. Eger may not have known, but her theory is in concert with the powerful wisdom inherent in Unetana Tokef. We are told that on Rosh Hashanah our fate is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. But the poem doesn't end there. We then affirm that Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah have the power to transform our destiny, if not for ourselves, then for future generations. This takana, this remedy, endows each and every one of us with heroic agency. Unetana Tokef requires that we insert ourselves into the eye of the storm and use whatever resources we have to mitigate a harsh fate for ourselves and the rest of the world. The Book of Lamentation concludes with two verses that are part of one thought. The first we already shared. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days as of old. But it ends like this: for truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us. I feel God's rage. And after all that I've observed in the last 25 years, frankly, I'm not surprised. The myriad issues plaguing the world that people watching this service might be concerned about at this moment include, but are not limited to, the flagrant assault on reproductive rights, a shockingly politicized judicial branch, the safety, security, and potential isolation of the state of Israel, a resurgence of anti-Semitism worldwide, the end of American democracy that truly reflects the will of all the people, the proliferation of firearms in the hands of dangerous people with no controls in sight, the rise in fascism and hate crimes world over, the destruction of precious lands and animal habitats in continued search for minerals, natural gas, coal, oil, and grazing land for cattle, the worldwide growing refugee crisis, unconscionable income disparity in this country and elsewhere in the world, distortion of life-saving truths promoted in what is now mainstream media, the inability and intentional decision on the part of so many not to discern fact from fiction, current and future pandemics. It's just some. The 1960s was a time of both upheaval and idealism. Many people living through the tragic events of 1968 felt that American democracy was in peril then. But there was at the same time a general feeling that we would find a way to correct these problems and move our country forward to form a more perfect union. I fear that we have lost the capacity to have that idealism. I long to return to a time in this country when hard-won battles for equality seemed possible, when the promise of America was a beacon of light for countries around the world. We combated Nazism overseas and McCarthyism in America. Vatican II was a watershed advance for interfaith relations. There was growing prosperity for the common man in the United States that previous generations could only have dreamed about. There was a belief that we were moving in a positive direction to realize the full meaning of the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal, entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We could sing that silly song at my camp because the capacity for change was in the air, and elected leaders were better able to work together to initiate life-saving legislation that benefits every American to this day. Our daily and long-term safety and health are now at risk in ways we never imagined. The challenges I listed above are all interconnected, and to mitigate any one of them will require partnership, collaboration, and personal heroic efforts on everyone's part. Each day that we do not take action to combat the current assault on humans, what's left of the world's wildlife, and the environment, we are actually party to it. Every person on earth, regardless of material means, political affiliation, race, creed, age, or gender, stands to lose this battle against global warming. A world effort to reduce this highly documented, well-understood trend must be enacted so that 200 years from now, which is nothing, 200 years, 5 generations down the road, our great-great-great-grandchildren will be able to look back at this time in history and recognize that despite all the things that divide us, we joined forces to stop and reverse global warming and promote the healing and repair of Mother Earth. It starts with you. It starts with me, with us. Now, money talks, so use your wealth wisely. Divest from gas and oil, invest in clean technologies, generously support organizations that champion environmental protection and cleanup, work on local and state levels to educate politicians you support to see the value in creating safe and healthy cities, looking to wean themselves from gas and oil dependence over the next 2 decades. We don't have 50 more years. You can do this. All of us can do this. Let's get back to a time and place when we understood that we all share a home with finite resources. People can and will lie to themselves, to others, and in public spheres. But nature, God's voice, does not. And nature is sounding the shofar, calling upon us to set down our implicit biases, our prejudices, our one-issue voting, our selfishness, and come together as a human family in a life-or-death race against the total demise of Mother Earth. Given the current IPCC trajectory, most of us probably don't have enough years left in human form to see the healing and rejuvenation firsthand, but we will through our progeny and through the eyes of Melech El Chai V'Kayam, the sovereign, living God, ever-present, who has linked his name with ours. At the end of every Passover Seder, for centuries, Jews would say with hope and longing, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. That miracle actually happened in our time, on the heels of unspeakable horror. Let's rewrite the camp song so that beginning this Rosh Hashanah, we can sing with lifted hearts, Happy birthday, world. Happy birthday, earth. There is healing in the air. Life is thriving everywhere. So, happy birthday. Ketiva v'chatima tova. May we all be inscribed and sealed for a year of good health, moral courage, and personal heroism.